Hi everybody. Sorry I didn't make a video the past few days. So I decided to make a video today on identity, especially in terms of ethnicity, race, nationality, and whatnot. So I wanted to talk about how I personally identify and in what context and in what whatever when people ask you, like, when you're first getting to know you and whatnot, like, okay, what's your background, because I have this, like, I guess, racial and ethnic um like ambiguity to me, because I am darker and whatnot, and I have like a slightly bigger nose and stuff. Like, okay, I could be Italian, I could be Arab, I could be Hispanic, I could be anything. And I've been racially profiled as a Mexican, I think, twice. Um, so I wanted to make a video about like how to identify. So if somebody were to ask me, like, what's your nationality, like, I would say American. But if people were to ask me, like, what's your ethnicity, I would say that I'm Ashkenazi Jewish. Um, and I use that as an umbrella term because my ancestors come from, or at least before they came to the U.S., they were from various places in Europe and different countries. In general, they were all a part of, like, I guess, one culture, regardless of if they were from Germany or if they were from Eastern Europe or wherever. I consider that all like Ashkenazi Jewish. And if people want specific countries, then I would say Belarus, I would say Ukraine, I would say Poland, and then I would say Germany. Like, those are the countries that my family came from, that are like the modern countries that they came from. But if they were to ask me, like, how do you identify in the broader sense of, like, racial human experience, like, what do you racially identify as, I would say that I'm a European of Middle Eastern origins. Because if you think about the migrations of the Jewish people, we started off mostly in the Near East, and then we're taken into Southern Europe. This is mostly for Ashkenazi Jews. Southern Europe, such as like Italy, and then parts of Spain, and then Greece, and then they migrated northward into France, and then Germany to Eastern Europe, and then to the Americas and elsewhere in the world. So for me, like, how do you identify? I would say that I'm European of Middle Eastern origins. So, because I've gotten that question, like I said before. Um, so yeah, I wanted to talk about, like, how I get identified. But then, for me, if I just want a general, like, quick term, like, what is your background? Sometimes I would just say Jewish, because especially if I'm in America and they were to ask me, like, oh, like, what are you? I would just say, oh, I'm Jewish, because it's sort of, in a way, it's perceived as a ethnic identity, even though there's obviously multiple, like, Jewish ethnicities that I think I've talked about in other videos, such as Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, um, Bukharian Jews, Jews from Africa, Jews from India, Jews from China, Jews from everywhere. So, but for me, when I come to America and I just say, "Oh, I'm Jewish," they're like, "Oh, yeah, yeah," and then they understand that you're Jewish. I did have a friend who, he said that as soon as he saw me, he's like, "This guy's Jewish." Um, but I think, there is that whole racialization because the Nazis considered us a different race. We were considered a different race in the United States for a really long time. And so it's weird that we didn't get our background as white people until, like, the 1950s. It's really, really strange how that sort of happened. Whereas other people from other, European countries were seen as white. Italians weren't seen as white for a long time. Even Germans weren't even seen as white, or Irish for that matter. So I think that racial, categories are quite ambiguous in terms of ancestry and where people are from, because there's the Roma people. The Roma people have lived in Europe probably as long as Jewish people have, but they, instead of coming from you know the Near East like our ancestors did, they came from like northern India and then migrated into Europe. And so they're European, but they're not European. And there's this whole like documentary called The Other Europeans about like the two groups of Europeans that aren't like really from Europe, and they come together and play music and share each other's culture, and because they borrowed from each other and whatnot. And so I think it's really interesting how people identify in terms of geography and place. And one thing I love about living in America is that you can come to this country and become American. Like that's your new like nationality. That's your new citizenship. Because for me, like in most countries in Europe, like you were either like German or you were Jewish or you were like French or you were Jewish. Even though there were Jews, they're French Jews or German Jews. They were almost like separate categories. And even in parts of Eastern Europe, they like in the Soviet times, Jewish people were that was an ethnicity that you had to write down on your passport. And I think it's interesting that people who strictly I see Jewish as a religion. I mean, in many sense, of course, it is a religion. It's based around religious customs, but when Jewish people go to different countries and establish like a different culture from the mainstream non-Jewish culture, then it creates a separate ethnicity. And especially when you take people who are from one part of Europe and then migrate into another part, then it creates a completely different ethnicity because Jewish people, Ashkenazi Jews are not Slavs. Like we're mostly we mostly had Franco-Germanic customs, and so like we settled in Western Europe before we went to Eastern Europe, and most of our culture is much more Western European than it was Eastern when they came there, and but they obviously added influences from other parts of that part of the world. And so it's very interesting how identities sort of form naturally over time and how people come to understand themselves. And I just wanted to talk about my opinion on my ethnicity, and I think that people should look into their backgrounds. They should figure out what they identify as, and be proud of it, and don't put down anybody else's culture because you're super proud of your own. Like we all have to have our own sense of pride, and we should share it with each other and get to know each other. So best of luck. Have a good Memorial Day, everyone.